Praise Yah and welcome everybody. We're going to do our Bible reading here. We're going to continue reading chapter 30 of Genesis. The Bible reading this week is from 28:10 to 32 verse 3. 28:10 to 32 verse 3. So if you want to take your scriptures out, we could read along together the Bible reading for this coming Sabbath. Hallelujah. So we left off here with Leah and Rebekah. Leah ended up having 4 sons. Yahweh had blessed her. And she, in this story, was the only one to praise Yahweh for these blessings and acknowledge Yahweh for these blessings. But after she praised Yahweh in verse 35 of chapter 29, Yahweh ceased her from bearing again. And we start off today in chapter 30, where Rachel saw that she did not bear to Jacob, and Rachel was jealous of her sister, and she said to Jacob, "Give me sons. If there is none, I shall die." So, right here we see some traits of Rebekah. And remember the family that Rebekah and Leah came from. And we see some traits of that here. So it says, Rebekah was jealous, so of her sister. So we have this issue right here. Now we go back and we look at the whole situation with Rebekah, with Jacob and Leah, and Rebekah must have surely been in on it. About the whole thing of her becoming his second wife, and now it's coming back to bite her as well here, because she went along with that, and now here she's being ignored, and Leah is the one having all the children. So notice what Leah did. Leah went to Yahweh and acknowledged Yahweh. Notice Yahweh saw that she was neglected and gave her children. We're in Genesis 30. Genesis chapter 30, verse 1. And she said to Jacob, she didn't say to Yahweh, she said to Jacob, "Give me sons. If there is none, I shall die." So we see the quite common idea here already from, we saw it from Sarah. We saw it from Isaac praying for Rebekah, and then we see it here with Rachel. The desire to have children and offspring was everything back then. This is why they got married. This is why this was everything to them, that they would have children, have offspring. So much so, we saw the great sadness of Sarah. We saw the great sadness, so much so of Rebekah, that Isaac, after 20 years, felt so bad for her and would pray for her that she'd have children. And now we see Rachel jealous and says she'll die if she doesn't have children. So the significance of having children then was so strong. Whereas today, not only do people try to avoid having children, when Yahweh opens up the womb and blesses them, they literally destroy and kill the baby. The times of today, and I'm not saying everyone, there are still people that desire to have children like this much, but we look at the culture back then versus the culture today, and we see the downward spiral and the spiritual warfare that is taking place, and how the enemy is leading people astray. And this is a big part of it. But Yahweh is the source of the one that opens the womb. We saw this in the previous stories of how the children, when the king took Sarah as his wife, but he didn't lay a hand on her, but then he let it go back to Abraham, how the king restored and reopened the wombs of the people of Egypt. And we see here that Yahweh was the one acknowledged for this. And Jacob understood this. And in verse 2, it says, Jacob's anger growed against Rachel. So he was angry against Rachel. Now remember, up to this point, Rachel was the one he loved. Rachel was the one that he had so much love for. But here his anger growed against her. And he said, am I in Elohim's place? Who has kept you from the fruit of the womb? So Jacob is acknowledging to her that it's not him that's in control of this. And unlike his father, who when his wife, when Rebecca didn't have children for 20 years, Isaac went and prayed to Yahweh that she would have children. And now, on the other hand, Isaac didn't have 4 other sons with another woman either. But here we start to see Jacob getting angry against Rachel. Rachel not acknowledging Yahweh. And then Rachel doing this again. So she gets jealous. She doesn't acknowledge Yahweh. And now what does she do? She follows the footsteps of her grandmother, I guess, Sarah, and says, behold, this is verse 3. Behold, my servant Bela, go into her. Here are my knees, and let her hear my knees. Ye let me be built up from her also. And she gave her slave girl Bela to him for a while, for a wife, and Jacob went into her. So we see the character here of Rachel. She was jealous. She didn't acknowledge Yahweh, and she made the same cultural call, not a call of Yahweh, trust in Yahweh in faith. And she said the main call of Yahweh, where she said, here's my maid servant, go into her, my slave girl, Bela. Take her for a wife. And Jacob now made the same mistake Abraham did. He didn't learn from Abraham's mistake, the trouble that this caused. And he said, sure. And he went into her. And remember what I said earlier. Every single time, 100% of the time, an open womb and an offspring is a blessing from Yahweh, regardless of the situation. Regardless of the circumstances, 100% of the time it's a blessing. The circumstances might have consequences of how that was put together, but that is the situation. Now, unlike Sarah, who sent Hagar away, this was the maidservant of Rachel, and Rachel welcomed the children. It says so. And Bela conceived, and she bore a son to Jacob. And Rachel said, and this is verse 6, Elohim has judged and has also heard my voice. And he has given me a son. So she called the name Dan. So now we see the first time of her acknowledging Yahweh. And she's saying she heard her voice. But up to this point, there's no record of Rachel crying out to Yahweh. And Bela, verse 7, and Bela, Rachel's slave girl, conceived again and bore a second son to Jacob. And Rachel said, with struggles of Elohim, I have struggled with my sister. Ye, I have prevailed, and she called the name Naphtali. So here she says, with struggles of Elohim. So now she's blaming her struggles on Yahweh in verse 8. Now we go back to Leah. And Leah saw that she ceased from bearing, and she took Zilpah, a slave girl, and gave her to Jacob for a wife. So now we see eh, Leah, the one that was acknowledging Yahweh, seeing what was going on. Remember, having children wasn't something that was a bad thing back then. That was their desire, their main goal. And when we hear things today like, oh, they had more than one wife, and and the kings had harems and all this stuff, all of a sudden the mind goes to a different place here today. But back then, that was their desire for children was everything. And Leah saw that she had some barren and he took Silpah, and gave it to Jacob for a wife. And Leah's slave girl Zilpah bore a son to Jacob. And Leah said, with fortune, she called his name Gad. And Zilpah, Leah's slave girl, bore a second son to Jacob. And Leah said, in my happiness, the daughters shall call me happy. And she called his name Asher. And in the days of wheat and harvest, Reuben went out and found mandrakes in the field, and he brought them to his mother Leah. And Rachel said to Leah, please give to me from the mandrakes of your son. Now, the idea of the mandrakes, we're not completely sure. There's many ideas of what they might be. Some translations will call them love apples. They feel it made a woman's body a higher probability of conceiving a child if they ate these things. We don't know if that was true or not, but again, it's not mandrakes that opened up the womb. It was Yahweh that opened up the womb. And the fact that Leah and Rachel and even Reuben were prizing these mandrakes and not praising Yahweh just again shows where their heart was. And Rachel continuously seeking to have children of her own was not praying to Yahweh, but she was looking to some mandrakes. And she said to her, is your taking my husband a little thing? This is what Leah said. Will you also take my son's love apples? And Rachel said, so he shall be with you tonight for your son's mandrakes. And Jacob came from the field at evening, and Leah went out to meet him. And she said, you must come in to me, for surely I have hired you with my son's mandrakes. And he lay with her during the night. And Elohim listened to Leah. I remember you said before, Elohim heard the voice of Rachel. Now Elohim listened to Leah. Here. And she conceived and bore a fifth son to Jacob. Remember, she gave the so-called love apples to Rachel, but she still conceived. It wasn't the apples, it was Yahweh that opened the womb. And Leah said, Elohim has given me higher. I gave my slave girl to my husband, and he has called his name Issachar. So we see Leah again acknowledging Yahweh. And Leah conceived again and bore a sixth son to Jacob. And Leah said, Elohim has given me a good present, and this time my husband will live with me, because I have borne him sons to him. And she called his name Zebulun. And afterwards she bore a daughter, and called her name Dinah, or Dinah. That was verse 21. So we go back to verse 20, we go to verse 22 now. And Elohim remembered Rachel. And Elohim listened to her and opened up her womb. So finally, he opens up the womb of Rachel, and she conceived and bore a son. And she said, Elohim has taken away my approach. So she acknowledged Elohim. And she called his name Joseph, saying, may Yahweh add to me another son. And it happened when Rachel had born Joseph, Jacob said to Laban, Send me away so I may go to my own place and my own land. Give my wives and my children, for whom I have served you, and let me go. For you know my service is with you, which I have served you. So now Jacob's ready to make his move and go back to his homeland with with all his children. And Laban said to him, please, if you have found favor, if I have found favor in your eyes, stay and have stay. I have seen omens also. Yahweh has blessed me because of you. So Laban here is a manipulator. Laban Laban does not believe in Yahweh. But Laban is using this to say, well, Yahweh's blessed me. And he gives this false thing. He's really saying Jacob was the reason he was blessed. He wasn't saying I'm blessed, Yahweh has blessed me. But he says Yahweh has blessed me because of you. And just not acknowledging Yahweh there. And he said, set your wages on me, I will give you. And he said to him, you know how I have served you and what your livestock has become with me. For little was yours before my presence, and it has spread out unto the host. And Yahweh has blessed you. So here, at my foot. So here, Jacob saying, it's been Yahweh that has blessed you. And now when shall I work for my house? I also. And he said, what shall I give you? And Jacob said, you shall not give me anything. If you will do this thing for me, I will remain. I will feed your flock and keep it. I will pass among your flock today, taking from there every speckled and spotted sheep, and every black sheep among the lambs. Also, the spotted and speckled goats. These shall be my wages. Now, the unblemished lamb, the unblemished sheep, that was what had the value back then for the sacrifices, for everything. It was the unblemished lamb and sheep that had the significance back then. Because even though the Levitical priesthood has not been set here yet, offerings were being made, as we saw with Cain and Abel. And whatever we look at in the type of offering it was, whether it was the actual animal or what came from the animal, or the idea of giving an animal, the idea was you give your best. And the idea back then was if the animal had any deformities, and back then just the speckled was not considered perfect. And this is why Jacob appealed this to Laban. He says, well, let me take them from me, and so on. This will be mine, and my righteousness shall testify for me in the day to come, when you come in about my wages, before you face everyone that is not speckled and spotted among the goats, and the black among the lambs. It is stolen with me. And Laban said, yes, if it be so, let it be as you speak. So Laban agrees to this. Now an idea comes up. We don't know if this came from Jacob and his own thoughts, or Yahweh spoke to him, or how this happened, but Jacob says, and he turned out in that day all the striped and spotted lambs, and all the speckled and spotted goats, every one which had white, and every black one among the lambs, he gave them unto the hands of his sons. And he put 3 days' journey between himself and Jacob. And Jacob was feeding the remaining flock of Laban. So Laban here tried to get a little tricky here. And it says, Laban said, yes, if it be, let it so. And he turned out that day all the striped and spotted lambs, and all the speckled and spotted goats, and every one which was white, and every black, and he gave them into the hand of his sons. And he put 3 days' journey between himself and Jacob. And Jacob was feeding the remaining flocks of Laban. So now Jacob is left with all the beautiful flock. Again, Laban tries to deceive him. And Jacob took for himself rods of fresh white poplar tree, and the almond of plain plane tree, and he peeled white strips in them, laying bare the white on the rods. And he set the rods which he had peeled by the throws, by the water of throws, when the flocks came to drink, across from the flocks. And they were in heat when they came to drink. And the flocks were in heat before the rods, and bore striped, speckled, and spotted offspring. And Jacob separated the lambs, and he set the faces of the flocks towards the striped, and every black one in the flock of Laban. And he put his own droves by themselves, and he did not put them with the flocks of Laban. So, whenever it happened, the strong flocks conceived, and Jacob placed the rods before the eyes of the flocks, before the throws, that they might conceive by the rods. And the flocks being feeble, he did not set them. As usual, it happened, the weak were for Laban, and the strong were for Jacob. So Jacob somehow, with some wisdom and knowledge, did this, and does not understand to this day how this exactly happened, but it did happen. And as we see here in verse 43, it says, and the man increased very much, and the many flocks were his, and slave girls and male slaves and camels and donkeys. So we see here, for these wages that Laban agreed to with Jacob, and what Jacob did here, Jacob became very rich in flock and slaves and everything he had. He became rich. Now we're going to see in the next chapter here, Laban's sons not being happy about the situation and what had happened, and rising up against Jacob. So that's where we're heading in the next chapter. But when we started this chapter, we saw Jacob with 4 sons from Leah, no other children, and he had only Leah and Rachel as his wives. He didn't have much wages left, and he was living there and not seeking to go back. By the end of this chapter, he was seeking to go back to his home. He had 4 wives, a ton of children, all but one has been born yet. And now he has his cattle, and it says he has many flocks were his. Now he has his slave girls, he has male slaves, he has camels and donkeys. So this stirred up the sons of Laban, and we're going to see that in the next chapter. That is chapter 30 of this week's Torah reading. We're reading chapter 28:10 to 32:3. Tomorrow we're going to read some of chapter 31 here, as we continue to read the Torah portion each day, and just get to know this. So praise Yah, praise Yah. And you all have a blessed day today. May Yahweh be with you this day. We'll be back tomorrow, everybody. Hallelujah, and shalom, shalom.